Dr. Van Buren, what a great pleasure to have you back in Lebanon.
I'm really, really happy to be back.
It's a long way from University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, where basically you are contributing to Patton Endowed Chair of Business Ethics.
Yeah.
I was one of the lucky ones to have taught with you business ethics, 5, 6 years ago?
4 years ago. It feels like longer in the midst of the pandemic, but we were taught together my very last semester here.
Wow, it's a great pleasure to have you. I have a few questions.
Thank you.
We're brothers in arms on the topic of business ethics.
Indeed we are.
And I'm sure our audience are eager to learn from this podcast. I have a first question for you. Can you tell us about your academic background and what inspired you to focus on business ethics, responsible leadership, and business and human rights? What specific experiences or events in your career led you to prioritize these particular areas of study?
I often say that research questions choose you rather than the other way around, and that's very much the case for my work in business ethics. I was the first in my family to go to college. My father was a union steward, so he would try to represent workers in negotiations with the company, and I saw that over time it was harder and harder for him to negotiate contracts. And in fact, the very last contract he negotiated was a contract to close the plant and essentially destroy the facility where he had worked for 37 years. So the reason I got into business ethics was I had seen what happens when businesses don't treat stakeholders like employees well. As a person who is the first to go to college in my family, I really wanted to try to think about the ways a business could make things better. Now, what brought me to academia was a very long journey. I initially thought I wanted to get a PhD in finance, discovered that I really had a passion for ethics, didn't know anything about ethics, and so of all places I went to seminary. So I have a Master of Divinity degree from Princeton Seminary in New Jersey. Realized I didn't want to become a member of the clergy. That sent me back to a business school. But the work that I do is really about the people who are left behind, the people who are exploited in some way by business. And I'm constantly trying to think about new business models in which there is respect for human rights and respect for stakeholders so that business can play the role that I believe that it can play in developing not just human flourishing, but ultimately a good society.
Thank you. In your opinion, what are the biggest ethical challenges facing businesses today? And how can leaders effectively address them? How do you believe responsible leadership can contribute to both the ethical and financial success of a company?
I think I want to talk about two major challenges that are interrelated. The first is business and shared prosperity. One of the things I think we've seen in a lot of places is employees, for example, not getting their fair share in terms of the value that they generate. We see in a lot of places there are societal pressures for businesses to play a proper role in developing a good society in which everybody has a decent standard of living. But there are many places around the world, contexts like where we are right now, where business isn't playing that role. So a broad meta question for me is, what is the appropriate role of business in creating the conditions for shared prosperity in which all stakeholders benefit? The second area, and I think this is really important, is the area of human rights. About 10 years ago, I was dissatisfied with where a lot of work in corporate social responsibility was heading. I didn't really see it as rigorous enough or demanding enough of business. And so I was attracted to human rights precisely because I saw in human rights a sturdier basis to hold businesses accountable for their behavior. Now, if we think about the role of leadership, particularly when it comes to thinking about shared prosperity and respect for human rights, it's really profound. And in fact, I'm coming here having just taught an executive MBA class where we focus on ethical leadership. And I spent a lot of time talking about the role that leaders play in thinking about corporate purpose, and a major part of corporate purpose being how you relate to stakeholders. So questions of shared prosperity and how businesses ensure human rights respect, both in their direct and indirect operations, are, to me, the front and center questions in the business ethics field.
But what about companies that do not comply or adhere to these business and human rights principles and standards? Could you share some examples on how businesses can inadvertently violate human rights and what strategies they can implement to mitigate these risks?
So let's talk about a product that all of us carry with us, our mobile phones. Most people would rather give up a lung than give up their mobile phone because we do so much on them. But embedded in your mobile phone and in the battery is a mineral called cobalt. And cobalt is mined primarily in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which has horrific human rights violations in which artisanal miners, and artisanal doesn't mean that they're artists, it means that they're essentially working for themselves, are exploited in horrific working conditions and earning just almost pennies a day for the work that they're doing. Now, Apple or Samsung, when they sell that phone to you, is selling that for hundreds of dollars, perhaps even more than $1,000. And yet the cobalt that makes the battery work, the people that actually generate that cobalt are not being treated fairly. So when we think about supply chains, it's not like Apple says, our business model is about exploiting people for profit. Rather, it exists in a system in which there are unjust economic relationships, and particularly in countries, and one of the things I'm sure we're going to talk about is what happens in places in which there are institutional voids and ineffective and corrupt government. Well, that describes the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Apple is not creating a business model to exploit human rights, but it benefits from those human rights violations. And then the question is, how do we hold businesses accountable for respect for human rights, which then has a knock-on effect on shared prosperity? So to the extent that Apple and Samsung and other mobile phone companies were able to act in a way, or willing to act in a way, to ensure respect for human rights, including ensuring that people are paid a living wage, that would have profound implications for the people who live in the DRC and would really not cost consumers much of anything at all.
Thank you. Can you discuss any notable case studies or example where companies successfully integrated human rights principles and standards in its business operations?
The example that everybody talks about is Patagonia, but I want to use a different example because the danger in talking about a company like Patagonia is it appeals to a very well-off clientele, and so it's really easy to say, well, Patagonia is a company that charges a lot of money for its products, so it can ensure environmental responsibility and respect for human rights. Let's take another product, and I often joke with my students that I'm going to make them sad because I'm going to tell them something they would rather not know about the products and services that they buy. So cell phones or mobile phones are one thing. What about chocolate? We know that chocolate and cocoa is harvested in countries like the Ivory Coast where child labor and forced labor are endemic. So large chocolate manufacturers have made noises about trying to improve their supply chains and ensure that they are trafficking and slave-free. But there's a company in the Netherlands called Tony's Chocolonely that is committed to eradicating both forced labor and child labor in its supply chain. Now, it's important to say it can't guarantee that because it's very, very challenging to manage these issues, but it's made the commitment to create a business model in which it manufactures high quality chocolate for a competitive price, but does so in a way that respects human rights. And if Tony's Chocolonely, a small player in the chocolate market, can do that, so can bigger companies, bigger corporates that have much more power and much more influence.
With the rise of supply chain, as you just mentioned, how can companies ensure ethical practices and respect for human rights throughout the entire supply chain?
Let's start with an idea that I've been working with called plausible deniability. So the problem with supply chains is it's easy to close your eyes and simply say, well, I didn't know. We know that the direct problems are not usually in companies' direct operations. They're usually 1 level, 2 level, 3 levels into the supply chain. But these problems also relate to the core business model of companies and how it is that they're doing business. So let's start with the notion that if you're a company, you have an obligation to know what's in your supply chain. And if you can't guarantee that your supply chain is free from human rights violations, why not? How are you going to change your business model? So for me, knowledge in taking on the burden and the responsibility of knowing how your business is affecting other people, both directly and indirectly, to me is fundamental to the task of business ethics. And it's really easy for a company to say, well, we didn't know because it was being done by a supplier, but that's not good enough in 2024. We have to demand more of companies, and increasingly, both national legislation in, say, Europe and Australia, as well as stakeholder pressures, including consumer pressures, are really expecting companies to change their behavior in that area.
What about the role of governments and legal and regulatory bodies, whether it's promoting ethical business or respecting human rights?
Government's a really, really complicated factor, and it's something I've been giving a lot of thought about, because when we talk about government, we're talking about very local conditions. So you could look at countries in the EU, for example, and they've done an awful lot in the domain of human rights. Not enough, and there's pressure to do more in the areas of human rights due diligence, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. But there's clear pressure on companies that are headquartered in the EU, for example, a little less in the United States, but certainly the EU, to take responsibility for human rights in their supply chains. Now let's think about where the supply chains are happening. Lebanon, China, Cambodia, Democratic Republic of the Congo. What do these countries have in common? They have institutional voids, weak and effect government. One term that is often used is that these are areas of limited statehood, in which the state is, for various reasons, either corrupt or ineffective, or just doesn't have the capacity to regulate business. And so then the question becomes, how do we change the behavior of business? And obviously, there's a role for international law in this regard. There's a role for domestic law in developed countries. There's a role for civil society and international NGOs in demanding changes in behavior of companies operating in places like Lebanon and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The challenge is building institutional capacity and institutional willingness, and these really do go hand in hand, to ensure that everywhere where a company operates, it is enhancing respect for stakeholders, enhancing respect for human rights, and ultimately making those societies better. And we both know that there are places around the world in which government doesn't do that to the cost of the people who live there.
In countries where corruption is pervasive.
So let's start with the challenges. Let's think about countries in which corruption is a significant issue. Lebanon is a very, very obvious example of that. I had the experience, because you and I taught the same course, and when we taught it together, and I imagine it still is taught this way, there is a semester-long project. One of the options was to have students write and then develop a training program on not paying bribes. It was a very uncomfortable experience for me as an American to introduce this topic and have my students actually laugh at me. And so that was an education for me in terms of, well, why does it feel strange or funny to talk about not paying bribes? And then they talked about what was happening in the local context. So part of the problem, Yasser, is that in a lot of places, people are resigned to paying bribes. They simply feel like they can't push back, and it's hard for individuals to push back. But if businesses work together, one of the things that they can do is they can establish standards to say that we're going to behave differently. Now, the challenge, of course, is making sure the businesses live up to their commitments. In parallel, there are multi-stakeholder initiatives that are meant to address some of these issues. The fundamental challenge, of course, is how do you make up for a lack of institutional capacity or willingness in countries in which bribery is endemic or human rights violations are also endemic. And this is, I think, one of the persistent challenges. There needs to be local activism and a place for business in dealing with these issues, but there also needs to be outside pressure. And how we get there is a fundamental challenge, because one of the things that really impressed me when I lived in Lebanon was how resigned people were to the context in which the state just isn't terribly effective at all, and that would be a very kind way of putting it.
Would multi-stakeholder initiatives be a solution? How do you see a multi-stakeholder initiative that involves different stakeholders, from international organizations to local organizations and civil society and business support organizations, come together in advancing ethical business?
I think multi-stakeholder coalitions and initiatives are incredibly important, particularly in contexts in which there are institutional voids. So they can involve groups like civil society organizations that are on the ground, that have local knowledge and expertise, and that have legitimacy to speak on behalf of the people that live there. I think one of the real challenges as someone who is a Westerner coming to a place like Lebanon is somebody could legitimately ask, well, who gave me a license to speak on behalf of the Lebanese people in terms of what they would want and what they would benefit from? This is where having local partnerships and on-the-ground knowledge and legitimacy is incredibly important. But then allying with groups in developed countries, or expecting that developed country governments play a role in regulation or setting standards. I think that there are multiple pressure points that need to be brought to bear, and multi-stakeholder initiatives are a really important part of that. In terms of making up for institutional voids, the challenge, of course, is that progress in those domains is really slow, because it's hard to make up for a lack of institutional capacity and willingness. And in an environment in which there are institutional voids for whatever reason, we're talking about second best solutions that are absolutely necessary, but are trying to counteract things that the state should be doing but isn't.
In your experience, what are some common misconceptions or pitfalls that companies encounter when attempting to implement ethical standards in challenging environments, and how can these be addressed?
I want to start with a baseline assumption that people make, and that is that people in different countries want different things. And so contexts are different, and the problem is that when businesses say, well, contexts are different, we can't operate the same way in one place as we operate somewhere else, I always want to ask the question, why? How do you know that? How do you know what it is that local people want? When I moved here in 2019, one of the first questions I got was, who is going to supply your drinking water? Now, as an American, this is a question that doesn't have any meaning whatsoever. You turn on the tap and the water is drinkable. It's not the case that people in the United States want potable drinking water from the tap, but people in Lebanon are just fine buying their water. And the same thing holds true with human rights. The same thing holds true with environmental responsibility. I think sometimes companies try to dodge their responsibilities by saying, we're simply adjusting to local context. And so I always want to challenge companies and say, well, how do you know that the context is really different? Now, contexts do differ, obviously, in terms of religion and culture and any number of other things. But when it comes, Yasser, to ethical behavior and what we expect of business, I want to make the very strong argument that there's more similarity than difference. And then the question for business is, how do you understand the local context, and how do you understand the way to best implement responsible business practices given the context that you're operating in, as opposed to simply saying, well, when we're in one place, we're going to do one thing, and when we're in another place, we're going to do something completely different. That, to me, is an ethical dodge, and I think it's really important to challenge companies on that.
Looking ahead, what do you envision as the future of business ethics in regions where corruption and international weaknesses persist? And what steps can be taken to drive positive change in these environments?
I think probably the most exciting area of work in business ethics is the emerging body of scholarship in business and human rights. And not every issue is a human rights issue, but increasingly there's an understanding that the human rights frame is a really important one. So let's go back to something I talked about earlier, the right to water. Everybody needs water to live. So if we understand water is a human right, then we have to put business in the dock for how it is either fulfilling that right or getting in the way of that right being fulfilled. So when businesses pollute water sources, they are fundamentally violating people's right to water, which is one of the most essential things that people need. I think that human rights are a really powerful prism to start to look at moral minimums. I think we need to adopt the language of what business must do and why business must do it. And this is where I think human rights are incredibly important. And what's powerful about human rights is that they apply in all times, all places, all circumstances. They're equally appropriate in Canada as they are Cambodia, and Laos as they are in Lebanon. And because human rights function as this baseline obligation, irrespective of whether there are institutional voids or not, businesses are still on the hook for ensuring respect for them. Then we have to start to interrogate, well, how are businesses ensuring respect for human rights in places where there is a high level of corruption and institutional voids? How are we holding business accountable for ensuring that there is a baseline of respect for human rights in every single place they do business, so that at a minimum, they're not doing harm? Then once we get there, we can start to ask the deeper questions about what does it mean for a business to provide positive benefit every place where it operates.
Thank you. What about the role of education and training programs and developing the capacity building? What role can they play to trigger this inflection point in business behavior?
I think I'll immodestly start with the work that you and I are doing in teaching business ethics and talking about business ethics. I think business schools play a very, very significant role. Let's go back to the 2008 financial crisis. There was a lot of soul searching on the part of business in terms of, did we cause this? Did we contribute to this in some sort of way? When we taught finance, did we forget to teach ethics as well? Turns out we did, and that's why the world economy almost died in 2008. I think business schools have a lot of responsibility, not just for the teaching that we do and how we form students who are going to be the future managers and leaders of tomorrow. But I think we have a deeper responsibility to be the place where these conversations are fostered. How do we bring together members of civil society together with business leaders who normally would never talk to each other at all? If business schools aren't fostering those conversations, who's going to do it? And so I think business schools in our teaching and research play an absolutely profound role, but I think we really need to be the place where these conversations happen and people start to talk to each other about the role of business in creating a good and just and dignified society for everybody who lives there.
Thank you so much. I've been advocating so much for what you just said. My last question, as a scholar and educator, what advice would you give to young professionals aspiring to lead ethically and responsibly in their future careers and business?
I think the most important piece of advice I would offer, Yasser, is you are responsible for yourself and your career. You have choice. Think about the students at AUB, for example. They are incredibly well trained. Some of the best students I've ever had in almost 30 years of teaching, I taught at AUB. And for me, the quality of the education they get here and the influence they're going to have generates a responsibility on them, several responsibilities. One is to choose ethical businesses. So one of the things I would talk to undergraduate students about here is finding a company that fits your values. And I think that's incredibly important. But the second, and I think that is equally important as well, is you're accountable for your behavior inside of an organization. You can't simply say, well, my manager told me to do this, or the CEO said that it was okay. You are an independent moral agent. You're responsible for your behavior. But more importantly, as you assume positions of greater and greater responsibility, your sphere of influence changes. So the ways that you treat employees, the ways that you interact with customers, the ways that you conceptualize environmental responsibility, you have agency and you have responsibility. So rather than to give that up to a business, to take responsibility for that very early in your career, because ultimately, I really do believe that this generation of students can be the generation that makes business better, but they have to be willing to grab onto that responsibility. And increasingly, I'm seeing students wanting to do that with both hands.
Dr. Van Buren, thank you so much. This was definitely inspiring, and I'm sure the audience will enjoy and appreciate every word you said. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to renew our friendship and to talk about these issues and to overlook Beirut, which, despite everything that's happened, is one of the most beguiling cities I've ever been in. When Beirut gets in your blood, it never disappears.
Beirut always welcomes you in open arms.
Thank you.